Okay, I'm going to start with some definitions here. Binding is a thin strip of fabric that is wrapped around, here's a thin strip, which is wrapped around the raw edge of another piece of fabric to finish that raw edge. Selvage is the two finished edges of fabric that run parallel to each other. So if you measure, so here's, say you got a bolt of fabric here, and here's the fabric coming off the bolt. Ignore that. These two edges are the selvages. And if you measure from one selvage to another, you have the width of the fabric. The length of the fabric is whatever amount you bought or whatever is rolled on the bolt this way. That's the length. You know, if you buy 1 yard, that's your length. Grain refers to the direction the fibers run. So with woven fabrics, there's warp and weft threads. Threads that run the length of the fabric, those are the warp threads. That's the lengthwise grain, parallel there to the selvage. And the weft threads are the ones that run the width of the fabric from selvage to selvage. That's the crosswise grain. So knit fabrics have grain too, and it's important to be aware of it and cut your garments out on grain to have them fit and hang correctly. And knit fabrics can be produced in a whole bunch of different ways. They often have these little tiny ribs that typically run parallel to the selvages. This is just kind of an exaggerated one. You just have to see it really close. I can't really zoom in enough to show it, but they have these little ribs, which you know about if you do hand knitting. So typically these ribs run parallel to the selvages, and usually the fabric stretches most when the ribs are pulled apart, which is usually the crosswise grain. But many knits are four-way, which means they also have stretch along this lengthwise grain. That's relevant because you want to cut your binding, knit binding, in the stretchiest direction and on grain. So bias, let's talk about bias. Bias means fabric that is cut at a 45-degree angle to the grain line. In the case of woven fabrics, a magical thing happens when it's cut on the bias. A fabric that doesn't otherwise stretch will have all kinds of give, and thin strips of bias can be molded into curves and sharp angles just beautifully, without any, without puckers. If I had to iron that, I could mold that into such a smooth and sharp curve. So for this reason, a woven fabric, when you're going to use a woven fabric for binding, you will almost always cut it on the bias. And because of that, sewists sometimes get so used to hearing the term bias binding that they think it's one word, bias binding, and they don't. And you'll even hear it. People talk about cutting their binding strips out of knit fabric, and they'll talk about their bias binding. It's usually because they are confused about what bias means. Not that knit fabrics can't be cut on the bias; they can be, but it's not typical. Like you might cut your knit binding on the bias if you wanted a certain cool look with a print, like say it has stripes and you just think it would look cool if you cut it that direction, or if you want to get a continuous strip out of a knit tube of fabric. But usually knit fabrics that are going to be used for binding are cut on the straight of grain, and not normally the crosswise, which is the stretchiest usually, or lengthwise can work too, like I say. So, but before we get too deep into that, let's go over some basics of binding attachments. So there's 3 general categories. You got binders for woven fabrics. They're intended to be used with woven fabrics. Got one buried under here somewhere. That are for use, here it is, on regular machines. So this is the binder that goes on with my regular Bernina, and it would attach to the machine here, and you put the strip in here, and it comes out here and then goes right under the presser foot. So when you're putting a strip in, a strip of binding, it's definitely helpful to start by cutting a little angle there. And the right side, this fabric doesn't have a right or wrong, but you would be looking at the wrong side. The right side of the fabric would go to the back. So like I'd pretend here, if it said a right or wrong, I'd be looking at the I'd be looking at the wrong side of the fabric. I like using a little biology probe type thing. I guess you could have stiletto or whatever. I just like these biology probes. So you get it started, and then get it in there, and then you can kind of feed it along until it pulls out. And here is where in here is where this folding takes place. You can see how that curved metal folds the strip. And this is a double fold binder because, oops, it's going to come out there. This strip is cut too wide for that for this binder, so it's not wanting to fold nicely. But you get the idea here that it makes two folds. Now, people get confused and they say, well, that's actually three folds because, you know, it's folded in half too. Yeah, but it's called a double fold because we're only going to count the raw edges that it's folding. It's folding this raw edge and this raw edge. It's a double fold, two folds, although it is technically also folding it in half there. So it's not called a triple fold. Anyway, so from here, it goes, I don't know why, it's just the terminology. So from here, it would go under the presser foot and get stitched. But this one is only for woven fabrics on a straight stitch machine. You wouldn't use a woven fabric on a binding. You wouldn't use a knit binding on a regular machine because the straight stitch wouldn't stretch. I don't know, those just aren't made. They do make binders for Coverstitch serger machines for woven fabrics. This is one for my old Fa. You can't use knit fabrics. Knit fabric just won't work with this thing. But it works wonderfully with woven. I have been able to put woven fabrics in my knit Coverstitch binders. You just can't go the other direction. But you can use knit or woven fabrics in a knit Coverstitch binder, which this is an example of right here. So from here on out, I'm just going to talk about applying knit binding with a Coverstitch machine and a Coverstitch binding attachment. Okay? So these Coverstitch knit binding attachments come in a variety of sizes, and they'll usually say right on there, this one says 35 millimeters. That means that's the cut width that you would start with. And if you're not used to dealing with the millimeters, you know, you can just use this little ruler. I set it for 35 millimeters, and I see, oh, okay, it's 1 3/8 would be the width to cut that for this binder. And sometimes it'll show you the finished width on there as well, or how wide it's going to be when it comes out. 28 to 10 is kind of a good general one to buy. Here's oh, that's a 30. I don't know where my single fold 28 to 10 went. It's underneath something. I don't know. Oh, here it is. Here it is. So this one says 10 millimeters, 28. That means you cut it 28 and it finishes at 10. So, and this one is a single fold. And what that means, I don't have a strip right here that is the right width, but what that means is that the top will fold, but the bottom will not be folded. That's a single fold. And so usually they're going to start a little smaller because they aren't, you know, they're not going to, only one side's going to get folded. And the advantage of that, I really like these, there's one less layer of fabric, so it's less bulky. And that when you're dealing with knit binding, it's not going to fray. Almost never you have that concern with a knit fabric. The raw edge isn't going to fray. So it's okay if that bottom edge isn't folded, and it can just be covered with the Coverstitch if you got it lined up nicely anyway. So these are nice. Now, I like having both, and I just have bought them inexpensively off from Amazon. I like these generic Sew-Link ones. That's what most of mine are. I bought I bought an expensive one for my Baby Lock Euphoria, and I didn't really like how it worked. I don't know. The Euphoria doesn't work as well as a binder, in my opinion, because I like the feet that have a little lip. Like the attachments, you can buy one for the Janome that comes with a base plate, and the foot has the little lip on it. I don't know the outfit in Sweden, Erica's, that sells the binders. I don't know if she has if her feet have that little lip, but it really helps the binding stay under the presser foot and not snake around. And I also like this blind stitch. I like using this blind stitch foot that I have for my older Fas because I can adjust this little lip by turning this. I can make this little lip here go in or out, so I can control my binding where it is left to right and where those stitches fall. So I like that little attachment. But anyway, there's a whole bunch of different ways to attach these things. And some people like to use this, they call it blue tack. This one's called fun tack. I'm not sure what fun they're talking about here, but you can use this to attach that to the bed of your machine. I'll show you when I demo with my older FOF. I just use binder clips to just clip the thing right to the cover stitch, chain stitch table. Some of these, if you have the correct model and that's made for your machine, or you're able to buy it, a generic that connects directly to your machine base of your bed of your machine with screws. That's easy, obviously, way to attach it. So anyway, back to single and double fold. I got up on tangent there. It's okay, I had to cover that anyway. I like these single folds not only because you can bind with that raw edge on the bottom to avoid that layer of bulk, but you can put fold over elastic in them. Now you can see the fold over elastic is a lot thinner than I would cut the single binding for single fold, and it's not going to get caught in these little folding lips to be the raw edge here. Well, it's not a raw edge. The edge here is not going to get folded under because it's too thin. But if this were a correct width of knit fabric with raw edges on both sides, then it would be folding the raw edge over on top, and it would be leaving this flat. So it doesn't have a little, this bottom thingy here doesn't have a little part that's going to fold. But for fold over elastic, it just holds it snugly, and then your presser foot's right there nailing that thing down. And these single fold binders are so easy to use with fold over elastic. So I do like those. I use my double fold pretty much, I don't know, maybe a fourth of the time, half the time, I don't know, it depends on what I'm doing. So let's see, we talked about the different sizes. You can get these that end up finished bigger or smaller. I talked about the rake. The rake is used to tension the binding strip as it goes through. I usually end up taking them off, and I like to control the tension on my own. And sometimes they don't fit with that, so it's easy to take off. You can adjust these little things that fold the binding here with these screws, and you can move them up and down or right or left. Once you mess that up, definitely take a photo first, because once you mess with that, it can be a lot of tinkering. And I don't know, hopefully you don't have to mess with that. Sometimes you do. Sometimes they come to you not really folding nicely, and you got to mess with those. So that's kind of a bummer if that happens. So yeah, okay, I think that's covering the anatomy of binders and the different types. Let's go into how to cut your knit binder. I think we're going to go into that in part 2 because this is already kind of long.